Hi, welcome back. This is lesson 56 and I'm going to show you today how to make a long seed stitch scarf with a chain edge, and it is 8 inches wide and 66 inches long, and you will need to make this 2 skeins of woolies. That's the cobalt color, 106-yard skeins, and then your contrasting blocks can be just about anything. You will need 38 yards or so total, but I held 2 strands together, so I used 1 skein that was 76 yards. You use half on one end and half on the other. And I used Yarn Bee Dream Spun for this edge. Now, you can make these metallic yarn, anything that you wouldn't want to wear around your face if it's a little bit scratchy. So it's a great way to use up even some remnants that you have, or use more expensive yarn in your little contrasting section. Woolies yarn is very elastic and it gives you good stitch definition, so it's really nice for something like this seed stitch. And again, mine turned out 66 inches long and 8 inches wide, and you can see, I think, the chain edge, which I think really dresses it up too. This is also a good place to use if you have some hand-spun yarn, something that's maybe a little more exotic. So let your imagination be your guide and the color of your woolies. And this will work up in about 3 hours. And let's get started. So you will cast on for this scarf 12 stitches, but for our demonstration we'll put on, 6 or so, just so you can see that turn and how to finish it. So when I'm working a scarf like this with bulky yarn, I would rather, as I did in the last video, just do a twisted stitch for your first one instead of a slip stitch. So if you take that yarn, the loop in your finger here, so if the working yarn is on the left, this is the working yarn is on your right and the tail on your left, and just twist this counterclockwise. 1, 2, 3, if you will, 1.5 turns, and then put that on your pipe, and we'll put on 6 stitches. And I used a thumb cast on to make sure they're loose, because you don't want the end of your scarf to draw in. And this is true when you cast off as well. And you will need an even number of stitches to do seed stitch on the rods. If you're working with another yarn other than the woolies, you will need to do a little sample. Now this is our piping that is the hot water pipe. It's equal to a US 19 needle, and it does the beige one in your kit if you have a kit for me. So your first stitch on this first row, I want you to back stitch it, and on subsequent rows we're going to be slipping this stitch, but right now this isn't a true stitch. It was just where we did our cast on stitch. So go ahead and back stitch this first stitch and pipe it on your first row, and then your next stitch we were going to back stitch this as well. So take your stitch off and do a back and a front and a back and a front and a back. And remember, this is just twisted, so don't let go of that. If you do, you'll have to retwist that stitch. Now you've completed your first row, and now bring your yarn up. We're going to slip. This is the second row. We're going to slip the first stitch, and take your stitch off and rotate it so that it's pointing towards the new pipe. I often say that looks like a horse with a bridle. And you want to make sure you don't twist this. It should look exactly like this, and pipe it. Then the next stitch also do is a back stitch. Now, we did a front stitch here before. We'll be alternating the stitches across the row and up and down. So when you see a front stitch, you know you have to do the opposite and make a back stitch. And when you make this stitch, because we're doing a chain edge, you want to pull on this side, this leg of the stitch, so that it makes that stitch firm. Otherwise, the edge of your chain edge will be baggy looking. This was a back stitch. and we want to front stitch it. This was a front, and we need to back, and we need to front, and we need to back. And when we start the same row, it's just like the second row. We bring the yarn up, we take this stitch off, and to slip it, we're just rotating it. Again, it should look exactly like this. Pipe it, then the second stitch is a back stitch. Make sure you have both the loops. I didn't that time. See, that was a front stitch on the last row. This time we need to back stitch it. And again, pull firmly on that side. Now, you know, Woolies is a really bouncy, elastic yarn. You want to be consistent as you're using it, but it'll give you a nice firm edge along your chain edge, which is really pretty. And then back stitch, because we front stitch that. That was a back, so we need to front stitch it. In the stitch, we need to back stitch. We'll make another row of these. So again, gets turned for your first stitch, and the next stitch is back stitched. Pull so that that firms up your chain edge, and this is a front, and this is a back, and this is a front, and this is a back. Now, let's say this is your contrasting block. Mine was 15 rows, about 7 inches deep. You want to make sure that you have a row counter, because you want to make sure that your blocks are the same size. If they're not, it will be quite obvious. So let's say you're ready to tie on your new color now, the body of the scarf. And so we'll just use these. Almost couldn't reach them there. Alright, I'm making a big mess here. Alright, so just to temporarily tie on your scarf, your yarn for your scarf body, just wrap it around your working yarn of your contrasting and just bring it through one time and slide it up. You'll be taking out this loop later, this half knot, and sewing in your edges or sewing in your tails. But for now, just do that and snug that up. And for this first row with your color of your body, and you'll do the same thing when you switch back to the contrast on the other end of the scarf. Go ahead and backstitch this first one because you want the whole row to be the same color. So I'll backstitch that and backstitch the next and front stitch this and backstitch this, front stitch this, backstitch this. Again, you want to do the opposite. Again, second row then with your body color is just the same as you did with the first section. Pipe it exactly like that. Then backstitch. Make sure you snug that first one up after the slip, and then front, back, front, and back. Now, my body of my scarf was about 115 rows. So knit until you run out of yarn, basically, and then you'll just tie on your contrast color. And again, make sure when you knit your second portion of your contrast color that it is the same length, the same number of rows. Now, you can also make sure measure it too, because just in case your gauge is off a little bit from one end of the scarf to the other. If you started off knitting very tightly and loosened up towards the end, you might need one fewer row. So just double check that. Now, let's pretend we're done with our scarf. And by the way, before I forget, I had a lot of trouble with my yarn twisting as I knitted it. And I don't usually have this trouble with woolies. And I think what it is when you are knitting something tighter, as this scarf was, and not loose and open, and there's still some openness to this, the tendency is going to be to at least this is what I found, is I am knitting with this. I think what I'm doing, and I'm mentioning this because this is a problem for everybody when they're knitting something. I think what's happening is I'm making the stitches smaller and tighter. I'm rolling my yarn in my fingers. And as I roll that yarn, what's going to happen is it's going to add twist. And I was finding, because I took this scarf out several times before I decided on the right number of stitches on here to have it turn out the way I wanted it. And as you roll those stitches, these are going to keep twining around themselves. So make sure you use separate bins, and if you ever mess up and you decide, you know, even on those scarves we did with the multiple strands, it's better to, you know, be very careful and take one strand out at a time and put them in separate bins if you have to separate them. And I had to do that in the scarf because it just kept getting tighter and tighter. So make sure you have them in separate bins. Now, let me show you a little trick with the cast off. So let's say we were done with our scarf and we would want to cast off in pattern. So this first one though, go ahead and backstitch it because now we're going to cast off. So this is the one we've been slipping, or, you know, the first stitch we've been slipping. But go ahead and backstitch it for our cast off. So that one is a backstitch, and this one is going to get backstitched as well because we're going to go in pattern. And now make sure these are loose, because if you don't, the end of your scarf will not have enough give in it. It will look drawn in. So now bind off that stitch. And the next stitch was a back stitch, so we'll front stitch it and put it on again. Make sure these are loose enough. Whoops. And the next stitch was a front stitch, so we back stitch it and place it on the pipe and bind off. And this stitch was a back stitch, so we'll front stitch it and bind off. And then we have one stitch left. Now, on a scarf like this, when you're not joining the ends, if I were to just bind this off, sometimes you get what is technical term is a wonky stitch. It will look better if you tighten up that last stitch. So, if you are, and this is just like on knitting needles, so let's say I'm binding off from left to the right. In other words, as I make my stitch, I'm putting on the right. In this case, so I'm working from left to right. I'm going to take my left index finger and I'm going to go just below that stitch. Not the one on the pipe, but I want to go below it to the next V. And if I take my index finger and put it through from back to front, and then I take this stitch off and I put it on my index finger. Now, I want to back stitch these because that's what I've been doing to stay in pattern. So now just go ahead and move them to this hand if you're used to doing it that way when you make your back stitch. And bring your yarn through and pipe it. And now bind off. And now take this last stitch off. And now you can pull your yarn through. Let's go ahead and cut it. I think I had two pairs up there. Alright, go ahead and cut it and pull your yarn through. And now you've tightened up that last stitch and you won't have that gap that also often happens when you do that, when you cast off. So now you want to weave your ends in. And what you'll need to do that is some type of yarn needle and matching thread for both colors, whatever you've got there. So you want to take your tails. You're going to have a lot to weave in. And you want to make sure that you, if this were a very lacy open piece, you'd want to stay where your knitting is the densest, but you don't want to use the edges. It will look really bad because you want to show that nice chain edge you made. You don't want to put your yarn around there. So let's say, for example, I'm working on this end of the scarf. This is where I just cast off. And you can weave them in separately, or you can even separate these two plies, pulling them down, and have 4 pieces. But in this case, I found with this, this is a 6 bulky, it doesn't show if you leave them intact and weave them in. Now you want to make sure when you begin to weave in that you don't go back through the stitch you just pulled those through, because that's your last cast off stitch. So you want to come back and go next to it, but you're going to weave into, you want to make sure that you're coming up and under and not into, you want to be under a stitch, not through a stitch. And so you're going to be doing what's called posting. So you want to bring your yarn through and you want to go around the yarns, make sure you're not splitting your plies. And you're basically going to be wrapping it, if you understand what I'm doing here. And it doesn't have to be perfect. And you're going to wrap that around. It's kind of hard to do this, to hold it up. You want to make sure that you're not going through the yarns, and you want to make sure you're not changing your pattern of your yarn. Now, it doesn't matter as long as you can't see it. Now, before you sew that tail in, and you're going to do that to all your tails. I usually weave in all the tails first, then I stretch the piece around. And then I take a needle and thread in a matching color, and you will sew this tail right to this stitch above. And I like to do it so it's basically underneath some stitches when I do that. And just take a few stitches in there with your needle and thread. And after you do it, then you can cut it. And cut it up close, and you'll never see that. And if you do it that way, then your tails aren't going to pull loose, because almost invariably they will, no matter what. And sometimes with wool yarns, it's recommended that you not even cut those ends till the piece has been worn or washed a few times. But if you just take a needle and thread, you'll never see it, and then you will have a beautiful scarf that's make a nice gift for Christmas. Happy watching. Thanks for watching.